Welcome to the Resellers Niche Podcast, a show for e-commerce buyers and sellers where we investigate unique categories of items being bought and sold and show you how research equals knowledge equals profit. And now the duo who'll never leave you shortchanged. It's your hosts, Russ and Mo.
Welcome to Resellers Niche Podcast. This is your co-host, Russ, and I've got Mo with us. How are you, Mo?
I'm awesome. How about you?
I am doing good. I want to talk about today's guest. We're going to be talking about hats. And we have with us David Maradiaga. David, how are you?
I am doing good, gentlemen. Thank you for having me on today.
Oh, welcome. It was just great to have somebody on. This is one of those topics that I like. I do some hats and stuff. So tell me real quick, just how'd you get into hats?
Well, I grew up in Central Florida, and my dad always had a hat on his head. If you ever see a picture of my dad at any point in his life, he was always wearing a hat. And so I just always kind of liked hats, and I just caught the bug. I'm a big sports fan, so I pretty much have a hat of every team I like in every color, and so it just kind of grew from there.
Gotcha. So what part of Central Florida did you grow up in?
I grew up in a city called Deltona, Florida. It's just in between Daytona Beach and Orlando.
Oh, yeah, pretty. Yeah, you're right. We have to wear hats down here. I mean, I'm in Central Florida now, and it is you wear a hat, or you can't see without them. So good. Yeah, let's talk about some of the different type of hat, David. I've sold some. I'm not an expert. That's why. We wanted to really speak with you on that and explain. Let's talk about some of the differences of like a snapback, strapback, fitted hats.
Yeah, so there are a number of different hats, and of course, every era of hat has its own, niches and its own different things that you really could learn from hats. So typically, I really enjoy reselling vintage hats. I just like, 80s and 90s style hats. I just love all those old sports logos that you just don't see anymore. And a lot of those hats are what you call a snapback hat. The snapback hat is exactly that. It's got the snaps in the back, and it's one of the differences between the strap back and the snapback is a lot of the strapbacks either have like a Velcro lining on the back, or they will you'll find that they'll have a clip, just like a button clip on the back. That's considered a strap back as well. And so those are just a couple. Then the fitted hats come in different sizes. So if you've got a watermelon head like I do, you could get a fitted hat as well. And those come in every size from children's sizes all the way up to 8 and 9s. Okay.
So, I mean, let's to talk about materials a little bit. You see all kinds of different hats ranging all the way back to, 60s, 70s. You got the foam, mesh, corduroy, leather. Is that more of a are the foam, the mesh, and the corduroy, are those more retro type, vintage type hats, or is that still popular?
Well, it is popular in some brands. You'd be kind of, it's a real niche if you find a modern hat that has foam in it, or the trucker hat's always kind of had its own style. It's never really gone out of style. But if you find a foam liner on the inside of a hat, for instance, on a trucker hat or a snapback hat, technically that's a really good indicator that you're in the 80s, even late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. You're going to find a foam lining on the inside, and that is just mainly kind of like a sweat catcher.
Gotcha.
You'll also find that they have sort of like a towel feel on the inside liner as well. That'll give you a really good indication that's sort of in the vintage era.
Gotcha. Now, I do know, David, this is a good point, a good place to bring this point up. I do know that there are now reproductions of the vintage. Is that correct? And what's the quickest way somebody can tell this is a vintage hat versus a reproduction?
All right, so if you come across a hat that, for example, Mitchell & Ness hat, if it says hardwood classics on the hat, that's going to be a number one indicator that it is a reproduction hat, because there's no reason for them to type classics on a hat unless they're trying to sell it as a classic version hat. A classic hat is just going to be a classic hat. It's not going to have a date on it. So that would be a one good indicator. Also, one of my favorite brands of old vintage hats to get is a brand called The Game. They make hats to this day, and they make the retro style hat as well. One of the really dead giveaways that you can look for when trying to compare versus a newer hat to a vintage hat, the logo on the back, which is the same logo that you would find today, would be stitched on versus being glued on a vintage hat. So a vintage hat will have the logo glued onto the back near the strap, versus being stitched completely onto the hat. So if you see that the logo is stitched on, it is a newer reproduction version of a vintage hat.
Okay. And is that for all kind of materials, like your regular cotton, your foam, your mesh, corduroy, or is that it's just kind of like a given rule for every kind of hat?
Well, it's given for the game, the brand, the game. Another way of finding that, you can also look at the tags on the inside of the hat. Tags on the inside of the hat won't be, they'll have a serrated line instead of being stitched into the inside of the hat as well. And so you'll have kind of one stitching at the top of the label, and then the bottom edge will be serrated. Looks like somebody chopped it with some scissors. That'll be a vintage style hat. But no, that's just particular with the brand, the game. Other brands have their own kind of way of doing things, but that's just one of the more popular ones, and one of the ones that you'll be more accessible, I guess I could say. Easier to find is the brand, the game, and that's one of just the real dead giveaway clues that you have a vintage versus a vintage reproduction. Okay.
And then as far as vintage hats, I'm guessing that, I guess vintage people would consider, is that the early 90s or 80s, or?
So vintage... Yeah, vintage you kind of consider anything over 20 years. And so 90s, late 80s, obviously, 90s. And even like till 97, 98, that's still considered a vintage hat. That's kind of the era that I really like to stay in, simply because those are hats that they're not readily available. And so, when you get yourself an old Orlando Magic logo, if you could tell I'm a huge Orlando Magic fan. I'll reference them as many times as possible. But you'll see, for example, they'll have an older style logo, and they change every few years. And so when you kind of latch onto a team, remember kind of what the old style logo looks like. That'll be a dead giveaway as well.
Gotcha. All right, this is a question that I've been dying to ask somebody. Now, this is on podcast, but you can see I've got my hat on and I've got the nice little curve on it. We grew up in a curve. What's the deal with the flat brim hats? Is that just style?
Well, style, personal preference. It's a number of things. I grew up with the flat brim, just as I grew up also with the bent brim. I played baseball for many years, and so I don't usually play with a flat brim. But it's personal preference. The urban areas, they kind of like their flat brims, their big cuffs in the front, and so the taller the brim, the flatter the brim, all those things are kind of more on the urban side. And some of the things that you find in the snapback industry as well is just kind of how they cater to the customer. The hat usually is pretty flat in general. There is no right or wrong. I wear hats of all sorts, but
Gotcha.
If you catch me in downtown Atlanta, it's probably going to be a flat brim.
If you catch me in a flat brim, it'd be because I hadn't grabbed it to curve it yet. I guess I don't. Of course, I'm not young anymore. So just kidding. You talk somewhat about the vintage in the 80s and 90s, but also you don't pass up on new hats too.
Absolutely not. Anything new with tags, I'm gonna try to flip it. Of course, the price has to be right, that leaves me enough margin for shipping and fees and everything else. But yeah, absolutely, I don't discriminate when it comes to hats.
Okay, and this is kind of, since Russ was talking about that, because I'm originally from the UK, and when I don't know what it is, because I left there in the early 90s. Right then, they don't have baseball in England, but for some reason, hats just went crazy. Was there something, obviously, like a lot of brands were Popular, Starter, and whatnot in the early 90s. Was there something else that might have happened that just went, this is pre-internet I'm talking about, so it was just crazy. Everyone was wearing a baseball hat. It didn't matter what team. It could have been a minor league team. They wouldn't have known the difference.
Wow.
Yes. So, okay, there you go. The thing about hats in general is it really transcends countries, it transcends age groups, it transcends nationalities, uh, economic different standards or whatever. I mean, it really, hats are hats. So not only do people collect them, it's a collector's item for some people. Not only is it a necessity for others, depending on where you are geographically. I mean, you're going to use a hat to keep your head cool, and just for style in general. So it kind of encompasses three really big niches in one item. And so there I can see why, it would cross the pond for sure. Also, when you have polarizing athletes, you have Michael Jordan, you have
That's
the Fab
true.
Five
Right,
in
yeah.
the 90s. That's time, those are times where baseball caps, you may not have the internet, but people knew who Michael Jordan was, or people knew who Chris Webber and the Fab Five were.
Yeah.
Now you have players from all over the world coming to play baseball, basketball, and all these other sports. So sports in general obviously has transcended whatever side of the pond you're on. And so with help of the internet, of course, fashion and all that stuff's all, coming back, the older stuff anyway. But
Right.
yeah, I can see how in the 90s it would explode even in the UK.
Yeah, it was funny. I would see these people walking around. I'm like, I've never even heard of that team. I mean, because I'd gone back and forth between the U.S. and here at that time. But so I guess it brings me to another question. Are there any kind of, I'm thinking hats, big brands, or mainly American brands. Are there any I don't know, Asian, European brands that are crossing over this way?
Okay, so yes, there are, and I will tell you about two, and one of them I came across actually extremely recently. My friend, or I say my friend, my wife has a really good friend who lives in Canada, and she came to visit us here in the States for the first time. She came to visit us. She's been in the States a number of times. She brought me a hat that is native to Canada. The brand is a Canadian brand. She knows I love hats. She brought me a black on black hat with a black maple leaf on it, straight up Canadian. And the brand name is Roots, like the band Roots,
Okay.
Roots. And it's got a little cool looking beaver, kind of cartoon beaver kind of stitched into the side of the hat. And then it's crazy. It's like when you buy a new car and all of a sudden you see that car everywhere
Right.
on the road. It was exactly that. I had never heard of the brand to that day. And since the day that I got the hat, I see Roots everywhere. I've even seen it in the thrift stores. So
Nice.
that's a big one. Then I have another hat, and this is more of a brand of hats. And a lot can be said about where a hat is made. Obviously, almost everything that you flip over is made in China. So it kind of almost loses its cachet when it's made in China.
Right.
So if you find hats that are made in Bangladesh, in Thailand, places like that are not China, and nothing against Chinese, but if you find something obviously made in the US, you want to hang on to that. But I found a hat, and it's actually a Thule brand hat. And so if you're at all into like mountain biking and road biking and that sort of thing, they make roof racks, they make all that sort of stuff for mountain bikers and whatnot. Biking hats, road hats, they kind of have a different sleek style to them. They're not as tall. They do have that flat brim. Most guys wear them backwards, but they can be worn like a normal hat. The brand, The Classics, Yupong. It's made in Bangladesh. They make the hat itself, and then companies put their logo on it. But that's definitely one to look out for. Like I said, things that are made in Bangladesh are hip in terms of hats.
Okay. And is that more of is that a material thing, or is that just because they kind of have they've got a reputation for making good hats now?
So they do have a pretty good reputation, and I wish you guys could see this hat up close. When you hold a hat that was made in China versus a hat that was made, say, in Bangladesh, India, any of those other places, the stitching on the hat, it's like it's double stitched on the inside. Okay. It's got a lining on the inside, which they double stitch, and then on the top, it's double stitched as well. It is just the quality, the cotton feel. It doesn't compare with just a regular made in China style hat.
Okay,
gotcha. Where are you sourcing most of your hats? Do you mind telling us that? Is it?
Not at all. Okay, so a lot of times I do go to Goodwill. I mean, Goodwill is just one of those places that you kind of have to go. Even if you don't buy anything, I go just to even look. But I like to support my local businesses. There's a lot of thrift stores that kind of cater to things that I really care about. So there's like the Humane Society thrift stores and that sort of stuff. And they already know, hey, David's coming in. We've got a shipment of hats. They kind of hold them off to the side for me. They let me know, hey, we got this many. I look at them, and then I kind of get to cherry pick what I want. But I try to stay as local as possible. I love to help the businesses in my community that are, selling hats and doing good things with the money. So
now you said you love the sports. Is that your biggest genre that you sell in?
It is. I'm a huge sports fan. I actually have 2 radio shows where I talk sports radio. So sports is huge for me. But one of the niches that I never did mention is minor league hats. And Mo, you did mention something about minor league hats. Minor league hats are huge because those logos are really unique. Those are logos that you're not really going to see on a mainstream level, and they're very limited most of the time in quantity. So if you see a a logo, a baseball hat that looks like it's got a funny logo, Google it, because it's probably a minor league team, and a lot of those teams don't exist anymore. So even extra cha-ching for that.
Nice tip.
They're great tip because one, they move, like you said, they do move around, and they have some great team names. When I was in Savannah, the Savannah Sand Gnats.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Mud Dogs, the River Dogs. It's just they have some great. So people really do like those hats. So,
yep.
Let's talk about some of your home runs hats that you brought in. Like you pick up a hat and you go, man, this is it. What are you looking for?
Okay, so first thing, to me, it's really important to get good material. If you find a corduroy hat, boom, you're going to make some money off of it because corduroy is just not a popular material in general. So, that's one of those things you want to look for in terms of the vintage. I've come across vintage hats that have corduroy. I always pick those up. If you find a hat that has a mesh liner on the inside of the front of the hat, so it looks like a weird little flap that kind of hangs down if you pull it down through the
by
hat.
At the sweatband area.
Yes, sir.
Underneath,
absolutely.
Right.
You find something like that, that's vintage trucker right off the bat. That's a $20-$30 hat. If you clean it up, if you take good care of it, it could be upwards of that, especially if it's got a cool logo. Even if it's a company that you've never heard of, a lot of times some of that stuff sells really well.
Okay. And then let's take the flip side of that, fakes, because I'm sure there's a lot of them out there. Are there any red flags you look for to say, you know what, this is a fake?
All right, so anytime you see uneven stitching, it's just like when you're looking at a bad pair of Jordans, you can just kind of look at it and tell. Logos, if you're familiar with a team logo, you'll see if something's off center, if the colors don't match up correctly. A lot of times you will notice on fake vintage style hats that the stitching on the inside does not match the stitching on the outside. And you can tell they use a different thread count or different thread in general. That's just cost-cutting measures for these companies that are, obviously you're selling you an inferior product, so they're not going to put the best quality into it. So those are huge. You want to look at just the way that's stitched up is if the lines, are matching up correctly, if the inside of the stitching kind of matches the outside of the stitching. Those are really big indicators. And then, of course, like really way off stuff just in general, if the hat feels cheap, you're going to know right off the bat.
Yeah, if the pony legs look all broken. It's yeah. Do you recommend, like on the vintage hats, do you recommend any type of cleaning technique, reshaping? I know there's a couple on YouTube that people do.
Yeah, reshaping is huge, especially with the snapback hats, because you don't want to take a picture of a crumpled up snapback or vintage hat. It's just a bad look. I clean the hats by hand. I use a light, all of the clothes and stuff that I sell in general on eBay and whatnot. I always clean everything with sensitive detergent, simply because you don't want to cause an allergic reaction to your customer. You don't know what they might be allergic to. So anything with an odor I don't use, and anything with a color I don't use. So the all All brand, ALL. The sensitive, that's what I use. It doesn't have a scent and it cleans really well. Toothbrushes are your best friend, or nail brushes as well that help clean the inside of the hat.
Awesome. Well, listen, David, I sure appreciate you coming on, and we're getting ready to finish up. Would you mind giving people your contact information? You have a YouTube, right?
Yes, I do, and it's actually super original. It's David Maradiaga, so DavidMaradiaga. You can also you could just type that into Google and I'll come up. You can follow me on Twitter at David Maradiaga. I also have obviously my Facebook page, but if you have any questions at all, you can always email me at thespotcornerstore@gmail.com. That's my actual personal store, and those emails come directly to me. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, if you you say, hey, I found this and I should I sell it, should I keep it, whatever, I'll be more than happy to answer to you. Sometimes I get a lot of emails, sometimes I don't get any. So just feel free to text me whenever you like, or email me, excuse me.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for coming on to our new podcast. And this is one of those areas that is just a fun area. It really is at hats, because they are everywhere. So, but definitely, if you're listening, want to reach out to David, look up his YouTube channels and his Twitter, and send him send him that email. And
we'll post all his links below, so you'll be able to see all of that, and you can just click on it. It'll be real easy.
Awesome.
But we want to thank David, and for Russ and I, would like to thank you for listening to the Reseller Niche Podcast. Have a good one.
Welcome back to Resellers Niche Podcast. David was such an interesting guest. He really was. The hats are such a neat area, aren't they, Mo?
They are. Actually, what I liked about David is we had a bunch of questions in there that we hadn't even discussed beforehand, and I just threw at him, and he knew it. So you really know somebody knows their stuff when it's just without blinking. He's like, oh, yeah, and then goes right into it.
Yeah, hats are one of those areas that it's also a great return. I bought a box of hats for $0.25 one time and made like 100 bucks out of it. So I hope that the listeners enjoyed that. We definitely want to we say this on a lot of our guests. We want to bring them back, but we could have these guests on once a month and still have so much knowledge to touch.
Especially David, because he knows a lot about a lot of other niches. So we're definitely going to have him back.
Well, thank you again. And everybody, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And thanks for listening to Reseller Niche Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Reseller Niche Podcast. Show notes and social media links are located at resellerniche.com. Please like and subscribe to us on iTunes.